Hey, this is Brian,
And Shelby.
and you're listening to the Hyperspace.
Pod Blast. Aren't you a little short for a podcast?
Huh?
It's Hyperspace Pod Blast number 24!
Oh, we're a ghost now.
Is that what that was?
It
I thought it was
sounds-
just a really excited older guy.
Or both?
Yes.
All right.
Okay. And this time we're talking about Star Wars comics with Michael from My Comic Relief. So what's up, Mike?
I'm, just basking in the excitement of spending the afternoon talking about Star Wars comics with you and Shelby.
That's right.
Yay.
As you should be. No.
I'm all tingly. I can feel the excitement radiating
That's-
through me.
So anyway, to the matter at hand here, how do you think comics fit into the Star Wars universe, or how do you think Star Wars and comics commingle? Is it something that works, or is it more something they're just, Star Wars is really good at just throwing themselves into every possible medium ever? So do you think this is something that's worthwhile, or is this more like a marketing juggernaut type thing?
I think both, honestly. Obviously you had the Marvel comics, Star Wars comics in the 70s, then Dark Horse had a great run starting in the 90s, and now we're back with Marvel. And I think when you look at all of those, there are some stories that are legitimately really well done, and they add a lot. But then I think there are other ones that you're reading, and you're sitting there saying, this was just kind of to get my cover price of admission.
Yeah.
And I think part of at least personally for me, when I look at part of the trick with Star Wars comics, is comic books are a really unique genre in the sense that they exist sort of frozen and moving in time simultaneously, right? So Peter Parker's bit by a radioactive spider in 1962 when he's 15 years old. 55 years later, he's, depending on the author, late 20s, early 30s. So the story has to progress without natural aging and natural progression in time. And so I think sometimes that can be a difficult thing to sync up with Star Wars when we are so aware of the timeline. We know there's a year between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. So we, in our heads, we're like, there's only so many stories they can put there before it stops making sense. So I think it can be done, but I think it's sort of a creative challenge to do it well.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. It's a weird sort of juxtaposition versus what you expect from comics and what you expect from Star Wars.
And I think that's one of the reasons that I don't read the main title regularly, because when Marvel first started, you have the main title, you had the Darth Vader series, you had Lando, Leia, Han Solo, Chewbacca, all hovering right around that time between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. And then it kind of gets to the point where you're like, all right, well, this is exciting, but I know everybody survives. All the important characters make it to The Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah, that's something I've actually brought up multiple times, where I kind of wish they would give up on this whole cliffhanger idea. Like, I appreciate what they're going for. They're trying to make you excited to read next week's, but it's not so much this, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? It's like, well, how are they going to get out of this? Because we know they do.
Yeah. I think maybe cliffhangers are more, I think they would be better used if they were used to say, I'm about to tell you some really interesting piece of information versus, oh, is this character going to die? Because that's not going to happen. And we all know it's not going to happen. Don't pretend like it is. But cliffhangers can be a lot of different things. And I don't think that's always utilized.
Yeah, I think you're right there, actually. And this most recent Darth Vader comic is a pretty good example. Small spoiler alert here if you haven't read it. Cycle through maybe 30 seconds or so. But they make it look like Darth Vader's going to die, right? I mean, he's lying at the bottom, all broken and stuff. We know that doesn't happen. We know he's going to figure out how to win, Don't make me feel like I'm, oh, geez, what's, it's so almost forced. I don't know what to call it, but it seems like, yeah, like you said, they could do better.
Right. I think it's just because, I don't know how long it's been, but it seems like cliffhangers are now all about death all the time. Who dies? Is someone going to die? It's always about the end of life but cliffhangers can be so much more than that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially in the comic medium where everybody comes back to life. You know, I mean, it's unless you're Uncle Ben or Gwen Stacy, you all come back. You know, that's so superheroes die and come back again and again and again. So the death cliffhanger doesn't have a lot of power, especially, you know, like we're talking about in Star Wars, where we know the characters go on. Like Vader Down was an interesting experience to read because all the tension in that first big crossover I didn't feel because I knew everybody I cared about showed up in other movies.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's the idea of, like you said, like how do we get out of this and maybe building a cliffhanger around something that you're legitimately excited for, as opposed to just like, I bet everybody lives. Oh, hey, I was right. Look at that.
Yeah, exactly. 10 for 10.
Right.
My predictions are amazing.
Creating that forward momentum without the suspense of life or death. And I think that's the challenge. And I think it's almost kind of lazy to rest back on, you know, are they going to make it?
Yeah, and like I said, it's obviously they can't be going from the point of view of like, well, maybe some people don't know these stories and they'll be really stoked on these cliffhangers, you know? No, come on.
Not in Star Wars.
Yeah. I seriously doubt any comic book aficionado rolls up to the rack and sees a Star Wars comic and they're like, well, I wonder what this is all about. You know? I don't see that happening.
And let's say there's the magical 2 people in the world who would fall into that camp. You're not writing the comic just specifically to surprise 1 or 2 people who are like, I'm curious what these wars in the stars are really all about. Let me check it out.
That's a very good point. Yeah, it's a strange situation. But yeah, I guess kind of going back to the main idea here, do you think the comics add anything significant, or are they more commercialism or just, you know, trying to get their tendrils into as many things as possible?
Again, I think it can be both. And maybe it boils down to the writers on a particular series or the vision behind a series. Because I think the real strength where they can add something is in character development. You know, as far as like to the point about revealing information that we didn't know. Because that's where they can really build in this ongoing monthly experience. You can add layers to a character that can enrich your experience of watching the film or experiencing the characters in other spots. But it's that thought of, you know, maybe what's the point? If you're sitting down and saying, what is the point? Is this a necessary story? And for me, that's how I look at a lot of additions to the Star Wars saga, is when I'm thinking about, am I going to invest the money in it? How quickly am I going to push myself to read this? It's sort of the idea of like, is this something new? You know, do I think I'm like the Captain Phasma comic that's coming out in starting in September? That absolutely is already signed up for my pull list because I'm excited to see that. What are they going to add to this character that we just got a glimmer of in The Force Awakens?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so a question here. We've talked about what novels can sometimes bring to expand your knowledge of the Star Wars universe outside the films. How do you feel that comics differ from novels, and what do they bring to the table?
Well, with the comic book, you have the experience of the visual medium tied to the dialogue, obviously. A novel gives you the experience to really get inside a character's mind and their emotional landscape. But there's a lot that can be done when you couple a really well done picture with an emotionally powerful narrative. I still think one of the best scenes in any whether we're talking the expanded universe or the Disney canon, is in the Marvel's first Darth Vader series, the moment when Vader realizes the name of the rebel pilot. Like, there's this really emotional scene where he realizes that he has a son. And it's done with these several pages, like 5-6 pages of very little dialogue. And you see, and it's drawn so well. You know, and you can see the tension in Vader's stance, and you even see the window he's looking out of on the Star Destroyer crack a little. Like the because like you see him just like you can feel him sort of lashing out a little with the Force and in the confusion, and so I think that was powerful, and I think to give us those still scenes added to that power.
Yeah, I agree. I'm pretty sure that's issue number 6, by the way, of
Yeah.
the first Vader series. That's that, and what was happening in the main Star Wars. It wasn't an official crossover, but they kind of mingled together there for a while. And that was, I think, I agree, the high point so far of the Star Wars comics, and that is some pretty intense stuff to lay down, honestly.
And it's interesting because I guess it was something that I never thought that much about just as a fan. You know, I mean, we always get Luke's side of the reveal. Like, we follow Star Wars from Luke's perspective in the film. So it was interesting to sort of sit there and think, like, okay, what would happen? And then Vader sends Aphra to try and figure out, you know, what she can about Padme, and was she pregnant when she was buried, and all that sort of, you know, it's just interesting to see how they bridge that story with the knowledge of the prequels as well as the knowledge of the original trilogy, and how that is explored.
Yeah, I agree. That was, like I said, one of my most faves. So since you did bring up Miss Aphra, what do you think the significance is that she seems to be one of the most popular sort of new EU characters coming from the comics? Does that give the comics some sort of edge over novels where, you know, I mean, there are popular characters that have come out of the novels, but for the most part, the novels are dealing with either re-editions like Thrawn, for example, or characters that have already existed. So do you think it's significant that Aphra came from the comics and not a novel, or do you think it's just coincidence?
When I first heard that she was getting her own title, I thought it was sort of an interesting movement of faith in these new characters that they're developing. Because one of my favorite and most vivid memories of reading, like when I first found the EU novels and I started reading them as a kid, is when I started to make that movement where my understanding of Star Wars grew. And so then as I read more and more books, people like Mara Jade or Admiral Thrawn or Dala, all these other characters started to feel real to me in the same way that the film characters were, you know, because their stories were expanded and they were allowed to take center stage. And so that I think was the excitement in Aphra, is the sense that they're saying, okay, let's roll the dice here. Let's try and go all in behind this character. And I think it would be cool if they did more of that. You know, I mean, if they pushed, we've seen Sloane, for example, have these little bit parts in the novel. She was in the Kanan comic, you know, but let her be center stage. You know, let's see where that story grows. Let's see how she rises and, you know, through the ranks and things like that.
Yeah. Do you have any opinion, I guess, on whether or not it has something to do with her being a character you can actually see versus someone you're just sort of described? Do you think her having that visual component of being in a comic helps her become more popular, or do you think it's just a coincidence?
That's an interesting question. I think from my standpoint, that wouldn't be part of it, because again, like I said, my experience of the EU characters were all in the novels. When I was younger, I didn't read any of the Dark Horse comics. And so if I was to say why Aphra sort of jumped up, my gut reaction was she's in the Vader title, you know, so she's with Darth Vader. She has BT and 000, who are these, you know, great, crazy, dark, schizophrenic, like violent, psychotic versions of R2 and 3PO.
Yeah.
And then she's sort of like calling her a rogue archaeologist is like, hey, we're going to take Star Wars and Indiana Jones and put him in this one great character. So I think there's a lot of inroads to connect with the character. But the visual, I can't discount the visual. And I hadn't even really thought about that. I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, that was my first assumption, was just that it's so much easier for people to latch on to things they can see rather than things that they have to imagine, I guess. Especially nowadays. I feel like imagination is sort of petering out.
Right. Although, I mean, here's my thing. It was just announced that there's going to be a Thrawn miniseries.
Yeah.
So the first thing that I thought of was, oh, wow, we're going to see what Vanto looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, Vanto was someone who I could imagine him, but I couldn't really see him. And really the audiobook actually confused me because my first imagination of him was not white. And not at all. And then listening to a little small snippet of the audiobook with his kind of southern accent made me imagine him as like a very clean-cut Texas guy.
Yeah.
And then when I tried to like merge those two imagination ideals of what he was together, it just ended up being like the grayed out avatar that someone has when they don't pick a picture yet.
The generic avatar.
So I'm like super excited to see how he's drawn. But, you know, I think about this stuff and the visual aspect of a new character, but then I think back, maybe Aphra really, like, the number one thing of why she's so popular is because she's new. And I think that Star Wars fans are just so hungry for new characters, new faces. And anytime you get that with a very strong character, someone who has a lot of development in their background, they've been very well thought out and designed, I mean, we just eat it up. I think maybe that's what's playing into it, and I don't know whether it's the medium that she was introduced or just the fact that she's this awesome new character.
There definitely is an appeal for the new. You know, we have this, it'll become, I think now in my mind, sort of like the annual holiday, like, hey, it's Christmas time, the new movie comes out, oh my gosh, The Force Awakens was the best Star Wars movie ever. Then you fast forward 12 months, and you're like, oh my gosh, Rogue One is the best Star Wars movie ever. And then, which I'm sure we'll hear with The Last Jedi too. So I do think you're right. I think there is this sense of, you know, how we may revise our opinions down the line. I do think as a fandom, to speak in gross and unfair generalities, we do that. There is this sense like, oh my gosh, this is new, and I just, this is the greatest thing ever.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to be said for that. And I don't know if it's, because, you know, they had this whole, oh, Star Wars is back thing, you know, but if you're really into Star Wars, it had never gone away. You know, they've been chucking out Star Wars content for decades. But it's something we touched on before too in this novel episode, I guess. But back then, the EU stuff was a lot heavier because that's all there was. You know what I mean? I think they're a little more reserved, especially when you're dealing with, like we said, you know, the big three or Vader. They try these cliffhanger things, but there's no real cliffhanger there because we know what happens. You know, we don't know what happens, but we know that they make it through. So it's just sort of connecting dots. But when you add a new character like Aphra, for example, and again, minor spoilers here. I guess it's not really a spoiler since people know she's still alive, but they make it seem like she's going to die in Vader. And that's an actual cliffhanger because you don't know what happens to Aphra. So that was like exciting. I was like, oh man, I really liked her. Oh, that's a bummer.
Right. I think there's also this aspect of how do you bring gravity to what happens in comics, Star Wars comics, especially when you have this idea of canon. Oh wait. Sorry, that's my canon sound. That it's something that we have to say. How do you bring gravity to what's happening in comics whenever, I mean, realistically, now with the movies coming out, you can't bring too much that would make things completely different in how you view the movies. Although, I mean, maybe you could. As long as it makes the story make sense to someone who's only watching the movies, I think that you can create content in comics that would completely change your view on it. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges is bringing weight to the storylines that you see in novels, in comics, in all the stuff that isn't quote unquote mainstream. So I don't know what you think about that, like how you bring that concept to those stories.
I think the challenge is on the idea of gravity and weight is pushing beyond just an Easter egg hunt. Because I think that is the temptation with a lot of Star Wars stuff, that we want to look for these little nods to things that we know, and then we get super excited. But I'm of the mind where I want the story proper, you know, to be, is far more, okay, if there's, hey, chopper rolled through the background. That's exciting. But that's not what I'm there for. And so I guess focusing on that interplay with the characters, one definitely is new characters. Like you said, Brian, with Afra, that moment as I was getting towards the end of the series where you wonder, like, what's going to happen. Also, I would say being willing to step outside of these tiny little windows in the Star Wars timeline. So there's this sense of we have, with the new Disney canon timeline, these 30 years between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. They're not doing an awful lot in that timeline because they want surprises for the films, which makes sense. But still, if you go back to, the period that we have, which the new Vader series is doing between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, there's a lot there that you can play with the transition from Republic to Empire. You can introduce all sorts of new characters. You can have storylines that we don't recognize because it's a period that's open. You could drop it in, like they had the Obi-Wan and Anakin miniseries. Mm-hmm. You could do stuff between the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones because that's a big undeveloped time period. You could go back before the Phantom Menace, step outside of the Skywalker window entirely. So I think between characters and where you're choosing to put the stories, as opposed to playing it safe right around the films we already love, they could create some really engaging characters at a different point in the timeline where Star Wars fans aren't like, okay, I know those 7 characters are going to live. Those 2 are a little iffy. That guy, for certain, he's going to die. I know that because I don't even remember his name.
Right. Plus, like, there's the whole, there are no more Jedi kind of thing. There's constraints that you have within the Star Wars universe. If someone kind of claims that title, you know that they're going to die. Or something has to happen to them to make that work. So, another question is, does Star Wars fit in the comic genre better as an ongoing series or a miniseries?
I think that, personally, I've preferred the miniseries run, and I think it depends maybe on the timeline. When they did Obi-Wan and Anakin, if you're looking at that time period between the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, you can run a monthly series there easily. There's a lot that happens that we don't know. Mm-hmm. I think the first Darth Vader series, there were some comics that I thought were some of the greatest additions I've ever seen to the Star Wars saga. And then others where I'm like, okay. Like, it was back and forth on my pull list. Like, it was absolutely on, and then I'm like, we're canceling that. No, I need to read this again. So I think if they were like, okay, we're going to do a 6-issue miniseries, or even a 12-issue, just say, like, we're going to do a year with this focus, I think it would have been, every issue could have been exciting, as opposed to some of them feeling like they're sort of looking for conflict. And, they're trying to put something in. Like, even the whole thing in Vader with him being disgraced before Palpatine. And, like, everybody else was like, haha, Vader, you suck. I'm a great Imperial officer who's cooler than you. But we all know at the start of Empire Strikes Back, he's the biggest badass that the Empire has. Like, and everybody fears him. So it's like, okay, I know this tension's moving the narrative, but, I know it will be solidly resolved. So I think miniseries works better because you could have one issue driving the plot without having to do it every month. But I think where you put it in the timeline can affect which is the more efficient role.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's just, I think with all of Star Wars, whenever you go and do anything Star Wars, you have to have some sort of idea of where you're going with it. It's never an open-ended thing because you just can't do that within Star Wars, no matter what medium you're choosing. So a miniseries seems to have some sort of direction more than an ongoing.
Especially in the, like you said, the pigeonhole they've decided to put things in. Like, you could do an ongoing in the Old Republic area, easy.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, an ongoing where they have it is just kind of like, first of all, it can't keep going, or you're going to run into what you said at the beginning, where we have Peter Parker aging 10 years and like 60 years.
Yeah.
It's just the numbers are going to start to be like head scratchy, but
yeah, it inspires that, the dreaded word filler.
Yeah, true.
And let's be honest, as Star Wars fans, and I completely own this for myself, we are almost programmed to analyze and overthink everything.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
And so, like, for example, reading Spider-Man as a kid, I love Spider-Man. I still love Spider-Man. I have enough Spider-Man shirts that I can wear a different one for like 2 weeks, and I am proud of that. But I could read 4 different Spider-Man titles a month. And so in my head, logically, I know one person can't be having 4 different adventures at different parts of the world at the same time. But that's part of the suspension of disbelief that comes with comic narratives. When you sit down to read Spider-Man, the Hulk, Captain America, whatever, you expect that. That's part of the genre. But with Star Wars, just given the way, and when I switch from comics to Star Wars, like there's a part of my brain that shifts into that overthinking Star Wars fan. Like when I watch Rebels, and there are some episodes I love, some I'm like, it feels like filler, but it drives my inner mind crazy that we have Kanan and Ezra running around with lightsabers a few years before New Hope. Because my crazy Star Wars mind is like when Luke starts using his powers, everybody is surprised. As opposed to being like, oh, he's like those dudes who hung out. Remember? Kanan, Ezra, and Ahsoka? That's what we've got here. That's awesome. And as a Star Wars fan, I struggle to disconnect that. So I think that's part of the issue too, is like we analyze things in this series in a way that doesn't necessarily happen, or at least to that extent in other genres. So that makes the storytelling difficult because we want that, we want this integrity. We want everything to line up, and it can't be perfect. Like a story being told by hundreds of storytellers over 40 years, you just can't have that, so it just becomes like I have to sit back and tell myself, like, okay, stop thinking about this. Like maybe you're taking it too far.
Maybe it's too serious.
So, Mike, what kinds of Star Wars comics would you like to see?
I would like to see more in the eras that aren't as developed. The Old Republic would be fantastic. I think that would be exciting. Mm-hmm. Again, between the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones can be exciting. Between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, especially if we're landing closer to Revenge of the Sith, because that's less developed, that can be exciting. And I think personally, I would like more miniseries, focus on different characters. And you could do multiple. Like the Leia one was great. Let's look at a different snapshot in Leia's life, or let's look at Luke. I mean, I know what he's been doing has been really quiet, but let's, once we have The Last Jedi and we know a little bit more about him, let's give something after Return of the Jedi where we show him on some sort of a spiritual quest trying to figure out what he's supposed to do.
Could you imagine? That would be, people would go nuts for that.
Yes.
I would, and so I think it's opening up. What I've always loved about Star Wars is the questions that it raises in me. I love nerdy fan speculation. I love, crazy theories about everything. And I love sitting and thinking about, like, the larger implications. If we're talking about, like, Lucas put the Force in there to get people to think about God. Not to say this is God, but to say, how does the divine operate? What do you think it can do? And so it has the potential to offer these big questions that as fans of the series that we can sit with. So that I would like to see that sort of, that embrace, that idea of this question and the willingness to go to different areas in the timeline, look at characters we wouldn't expect, and, in addition to having fun and seeing, laser guns shooting and lightsabers crashing, like, play with some of the big, more thematic points.
Right on.
Well, that's all we have time for today.
Wow.
But if
this was exciting.
I know, right? Where can people find you, Mike?
You can find me hanging out on the internet at mycomicrelief.wordpress.com, or if you prefer situations that come in 140 characters or less, you can find me on Twitter at my_comicrelief.
Perfect.
Awesome. Well, we will talk to you later, and thanks again for coming on the show.
Yeah, it was a
Thank
good
you
time.
for having
Thanks,
me. This was fantastic.
Again, you can find us on Twitter at hyperspace_pod. Email us hyperspacepodblast@gmail.com.
And the website is hyperspacepodblast.com.
All right. Catch you later, guys. Bye. Thanks, Mike.
Bye.